I pledge that by 6 o'clock we're going to be done, and then there's going to be a reception where you can imbibe some wine and we can all relax. This panel really poses a question of how should you think about whether and how to engage with a regime or an evildoer. It's a topic that I've actually been quite interested in as a student of negotiation and conflict resolution for a little over a decade. Because what 9/11 posed for me, among other things, was the question of the limits of negotiation. What most don't remember now is that immediately after 9/11, Mullah Omar, who was then the head of the Afghan government, when accused of harboring al-Qaeda, his initial response to the Bush administration was, well, let's negotiate. What's your evidence? Under Islamic law, we have responsibilities for our guests. And President Bush sent a Saudi representative. The United States at the time did not recognize the Afghan government. Sent a Saudi to say, no, this isn't, his was not an invitation to negotiate. He's making a demand that you disband the camps and turn over the leaders of al-Qaeda, or there's going to be a war. And my colleague Roger Fisher and I had a public discussion of sorts about whether it was appropriate to refuse to negotiate. And I found myself in the uncomfortable position of, in that context at that time, arguing that it was appropriate to refuse. And in fact, Gabby Bloom, who has been one of my students, and I embarked on a project where we really wanted to start thinking about the limits of negotiation. And I guess what I just want to say is this panel is going to deal with these kinds of issues. And the dilemmas are many and profound because, in fact, people's refusing to negotiate with the other is often a result of fast thinking, not slow thinking, a variety of cognitive and social psychological traps relating to the other, which means that one has not necessarily thought through carefully in a cost and benefit sense the risks and opportunities of engaging. On the other hand, it also poses some pretty profound philosophical questions that were touched on in our first session today. And that is, and there have been echoes of since, and that is, what do you do when, in fact, your desire to pursue justice, which is characteristically backward-looking and deeply judgmental, is in tension with the desire to have peace and reconciliation going forward? And in my mind, that's not a trivial question. And a part of what we're going to be discussing today is that tension and how to manage it. I'm not going to introduce the individuals. I think it's an extraordinary panel. Although there are 5 of us, in fact, there are really only 3 presentations of sorts. The first is going to be by Charles Kogan. My friend Luis Moreno Ocampo and I are then doing a duo where we're really talking about the same issue, but we have different somewhat different points of view. And then finally, Professors Blum and Hyman are also going to be doing a presentation together. But let me first simply ask Charles Cogan to begin. He is going to be focusing on the conflict with Iran at the time that, in fact, students took American prisoners. I should point out his extraordinary resume, and that from 1979 to 1984, and I think that encompasses this period, Charles? He was chief of the Near East South Asia Division in the Directorate of Operations of the CIA. So this is a man who is a stupendous scholar, who after retired from the CIA got a PhD under Stanley Hoffman, and it's my great privilege to count him as a friend. He's Charles.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here, honored to be here. As Bob mentioned, I was Chief Near East South Asia in the CIA Operations Directorate. Now, I want to take you back to November 4th, 1979. And in this division in the Operations Directorate, Near East South Asia, we knew it colloquially as the area from Marrakesh to Bangladesh. At that very moment, about 4 in the morning, November 4th, 1979, I was asleep in my bed in Bethesda, outside Washington. My deputy for South Asia phoned and said, "They're coming over the wall." The Iranian hostage crisis had begun. Actually, it was a little deceptive because virtually the same thing had happened earlier that year in February. A group of so-called students had overrun the embassy, but they were sent away in a couple of days thanks to the intervention of the then ambassador, William Sullivan. Sullivan, together with a member of the National Front government, arranged the release. The National Front was moderate and democratic in the lineage of Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister who had been deposed in the 1950s through the efforts of the CIA and Britain's MI6. But this time in November 1979, there was no ambassador because he'd gone, and he left the charge d'affaires to run the embassy. This is Bruce Langan. There was no National Front representative to intervene either. The day before, November 3rd, the National Front government had been dismissed by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and Khomeini had come back to Iran in February 79. The apparent reason for the dismissal was Khomeini's disapproval of the fact that 3 National Front leaders had had a meeting in Algiers on 3 November with Zbig Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor. Actually, we now know in retrospect that the hostage takers, known as the students in the line of the Imam Ali Khomeini, did not expect to remain in the embassy more than a couple of days. Another interesting fact, which came out retrospectively, was that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was a member of the students in the line of the Imam. In the famous photograph of the blindfolded American hostages, you can't see him. You can't see the person who looks like him. He's on the right side of the frame, but it's outside the frame. This man on the right looks like Ahmadinejad. However, it is not Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad had wanted to invest the Soviet embassy as well, but he was overruled, so he did not take part in the seizure of the American embassy. 3 days after the attack on the embassy, Ayatollah Khomeini announced that he supported the action of the students, and the hostages would remain in the embassy unharmed until Iran's just grievances, quote unquote, had been satisfied. At the time of the hostage seizure, the U.S. government knowledge of Iran and the Iranians was limited, despite the fact of a huge American presence in the country prior to the fall of the Shah at the end of 1978, beginning 1979. American academics were invited to CIA headquarters to impart their knowledge of the country. People like Richard Cottam of the University of Pittsburgh and Marvin Zonas of the University of Chicago. We were told, for example, that the Iranians were different, that Shiism was a religion of protest and martyrdom and was not really an establishment religion, and that dissimulation in the face of a superior adversary was considered a virtue in Iran. It even had a name, Taqiyya. It was a moment of extreme frustration in Washington. As I later wrote, the unspeakable had been committed by the unseizable. Taking hostages on the extraterritoriality of a foreign country, in other words, an embassy, was virtually unprecedented in modern times. No one on the American side could get to Ayatollah Khomeini, the one person who could settle the issue, and he had isolated himself in the holy city of Qom outside Tehran. At the head of the new government in Tehran were the elusive figures of Sadek Qutbzadeh and the Prime Minister Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, whose standing with the Imam was uncertain and changing. Their very elusiveness impelled the authorities in Washington to seek out intermediaries to them, including, improbably, 2 Argentinian businessmen. Various solutions were proposed and then discarded. These included a declaration of war, a naval blockade, and the mining of Iranian ports. Some of the suggestions were wild. For example, a predecessor of mine proposed that a detachment of the 82nd Airborne Division land at Mehrabad Airport, march to the embassy, recover the hostages, march back, and depart the airport. This was utterly impractical given the density of the population of Iran, 4 million people, but it was indicative of the frustration in Washington at what came to be called later asymmetric warfare. I coined the term soft war. Moreover, Washington was confronted with the phenomenon of Islamic fundamentalism, a new and deranging event. In the space of several weeks in November 1979, there was also the attack on the Mecca Mosque, followed, after the exhortations of Khomeini, by an attack on the American embassy in Islamabad. Islamic fundamentalism seemed to have the effect of a tidal wave which could sweep away the American position in the Muslim world. Here we come to the counterfactual question of what would have been the American reaction if, instead of Jimmy Carter as president, it would have been, say, Ronald Reagan. One thing is certain, it would not have taken 5 months before the U.S. took action militarily. I would characterize Jimmy Carter as a near-pacifist president. He did not want to have to undertake a rescue operation, preparations for which started almost immediately after the start of the hostage crisis. He much preferred a negotiated solution. Here we come to the other side of the story, the Iranian side and the personality of Ayatollah Khomeini. The Ayatollah had a certain aura about him. He was a religious figure, despite his stern and uncompromising exterior. He was not fully recognized by the American side as the personification of evil, which, as far as his attitude toward the U.S. was concerned, put him squarely in this category. Khomeini had many grievances against the United States, including his expulsion from Iran in 1963, for which he held the Americans responsible. According to the Iranian affairs expert Gary Sick, and I quote, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and most in the State Department held that Iran's revolution was unique and that there were good reasons therefore. As an aside, I might note that the Iranians were rather captivated by the idea that Vance had a Persian first name and he might be favorable to them. I continue with Gary Sick. Iran's revolution was unique and that there were good reasons therefore. The perception that the U.S. was behind the Shah explained why the regime was acting in the way it was. To deal with the regime, one had to understand what had gone on before. There was a second point of view, however, represented by Brzezinski, along with some people in the Pentagon and others outside the administration. They felt that to deal with the revolution, one had to stand up to them, make them understand your motives. Don't relinquish national honor. The extreme manifestation of the point of view of the State Department was the notion that the United States should act in such a way that Khomeini would regard the liberation of the hostages as a personal triumph. President Carter had some sympathy for this point of view. Thus, the Carter administration, in its efforts to wipe the slate clean, and in a sort of manifestation of the Stockholm Syndrome, took upon itself the blame for the past wrongs of U.S. actions in Iran, in an effort to woo Khomeini into giving up the hostages. Most notably, this approach is contained in a letter of January 12, 1980, sent by President Carter to the Iranian government through the UN Secretary Kurt Waldheim. It included the following language: "The United States understands and sympathizes with the grievances felt by many Iranian citizens concerning the practices of the former regime. The United States is prepared to work out in advance firm understandings on a forum in which those grievances may be subsequently aired, so that the hostages could be released with the confidence that those grievances would be heard in an appropriate forum after the release has taken place." This was perhaps the high point of the Carter administration's macabre-ish approach to the hostage crisis. How could one expect Khomeini to give up his trump card, the hostages, in return for an ex post facto forum which would simply air grievances? As Peter Rodman, an NSC staff member in the Nixon and Ford administrations, as he observed in this context, and I quote, "Americans find it congenitally difficult to grasp the possibility that an adversary can be implacably hostile, uninterested in compromise, determined only to do America harm. The expression of bitter grievances against the United States rather tends to evoke sympathy, triggering a reflex to show understanding on the assumption that the embittered must be and can be conciliated." By March 1980, with the failure of a UN mission to Tehran aimed at securing the release of the hostages, and with the announcement by Khomeini that the new Majlis, or parliament, would have to decide on the fate of the hostages, but however the Majlis would not meet until May, the turn to a hostage rescue operation took center stage. Without a declaration of war, without an open military threat against the United States, the administration proceeded to put in motion a surreptitious entry operation aimed at freeing the hostages virtually at the other end of the world. I'm not going to go into detail on the rescue operation, which is a whole other story, but I will say that the very complexity of the rescue attempt and the secrecy required led the planners to select a means of getting out of the operation at each stage in its unfolding. This viewpoint, very much that of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, here's the Chairman David Jones, robbed the operation of what it seems to me was a vital element: confidence in a victorious result. That, plus the less than optimal coordination among the military services and between the military and the CIA, helped to doom the operation. The observation after the fact by the then Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown, that only the United States could have undertaken an operation of such complexity was not only a questionable attempt at justification, but also an irrefutable affirmation. But there are those who thought that the operation should have gone ahead even with a supposedly insufficient number of helicopters. And you will find this viewpoint expressed in my article on the subject, published in the January 1993 issue of the Journal of Military History. It is entitled Desert One and Its Disorders. I have some copies on the table there if anyone wants them. You can say it was night and day between the hostage rescue operation of April 1980 and the taking down of Osama bin Laden some 30 years later. As Admiral William McRaven, the leader of the bin Laden operation, remarked, "This operation would not have been possible had the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command not spent the last decade in bed together." Thank you.
Our joint presentation is going to be about the tension between peace and justice. And I'd like to set the stage by suggesting a not so hypothetical hypothetical. It's the year 2014. The war-torn country of Afghanistan is hobbling towards a fragile ceasefire. Hamid Karzai and the Taliban have struck a tentative deal, which a war-weary American government supports. The Taliban will renounce al-Qaeda and terrorism. All remaining NATO combat troops will be scheduled to leave Afghanistan. The peace accord contemplates regional power sharing and national reconciliation. Mullah Omar and other exiled Taliban leaders will be allowed to return to the country and participate openly in Afghan politics. An essential element of the deal, negotiated by the Afghanistanis, is a general amnesty in which all combatants, including Mullah Omar and various warlords, will be given immunity in Afghan courts from prosecution for crimes committed during the hostilities. Now, I want you to imagine that you're in the position of the International Criminal Prosecutor in 2014. American and United Nations diplomats informally tell you that actions on your part in which you initiate prosecutions or intensive investigations are likely to derail the fragile peace process and plunge the ravaged country back into deadly civil war. How would you respond? To what extent, if any, should you, as the responsible prosecutor charged with the enforcement of the Rome Statute, consider the potential impact your actions may have on efforts to end armed conflict and promote national reconciliation? Now, history demonstrates, I would suggest, that the tension between justice and peace is not simply an abstraction. Foregone justice, for example, amnesty from imprisonment, is, quote, often the price for getting rid of tyrants and their associates. And, quote, one of the techniques for ending civil wars or enabling transitions from authoritarian to democratic government. As Alexander Hamilton recognized more than 2 centuries ago, in seasons of insurrection or rebellion, there are often critical moments when a well-timed offer of pardon to the insurgents or rebels may restore tranquility to the Commonwealth. On the other hand, allowing perpetrators to bargain for immunity profoundly offends our sense of justice and hardly serves deterrence. How should the prosecutor manage this tension? Now, let me just say a very few words, and I have a paper that spells it out, but you're not going to be interested in all the legal details. Let me report, though, that the Rome Statute, a treaty, provides a framework for the investigation, prosecution, and punishment of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Afghanistan is a signatory. The prosecutor may only investigate and prosecute crimes that fall within the jurisdiction of the court. And it would certainly appear that the crimes that many feel have certainly been committed in Afghanistan might well meet the statute's jurisdictional standards. What is interesting and what got me interested in this topic was there's the prosecutor, my friend Luis's office, issued in 2007, a policy paper on what at first reading appears to be an exception that would permit the prosecutor not in some circumstances to prosecute. Article 53 of the Rome Statute explicitly provides that the prosecutor may decline to investigate or prosecute crimes squarely within the ICC's jurisdiction because the prosecutor believes pursuing the crime does not serve, quote, the interests of justice. Needless to say, the words of Article 53 are hardly self-defining. On the one hand, there's no reference to peace and reconciliation. On the other hand, the idea that interests might be broad enough to include consideration of the impact on peacemaking processes, I don't think is implausible. Indeed, it appears that the ambiguity in this and other provisions of the Rome Treaty was deliberate in the sense that the signatories really were clear that on the one hand, they wanted to deter. Deterrence was at the core of these worst kinds of crimes. But on the other hand, they wanted there to be some exceptions possible, but they couldn't define what they might be. In all events, the prosecutor's policy paper categorically rejected any consideration of the impact on peace processes because of the Rome Statute's deterrence goal and because of the prosecutor's institutional role. Now, I actually am somewhat sympathetic with the prosecutor's stance. And indeed, in my paper, which I'd be glad to share with anyone who's interested, I suggest that as a hand-tying exercise, it was really a pretty clever move. By saying, I will not bargain where issues of peace and reconciliation are taken into account, he in fact avoids the awful dilemma of having to negotiate with some warlord or tyrant, you can imagine Assad in Syria today, who in fact probably has committed gruesome crimes. The grant of immunity obviously might well vitiate deterrence. And indeed, would-be war criminals might figure that if they could bargain for peace, they might step up their atrocities towards the end in order to gain more leverage. What is most troubling to me is not the policy paper's conclusion with respect to Article 3, but its more sweeping rhetoric that appears to suggest the prosecutor had to choose between peacemaking or justice, that only one value to the exclusion of the other was relevant even in his role. That indeed, I think implicit is an idea that the peace versus justice frame is kind of a zero-sum either-or choice, that more of one means less of the other. I think that's a gross simplification. And I think things can be can depend a lot in terms of context. In all events, what I want to do is suggest the following, that the prosecutor should manage the tension, not ignore it. How? Well, I offer in my paper 4 guidelines. And I'm going to just very briefly mention the guidelines. The first guideline: the prosecutor should use timing, including the delay of investigation or prosecution, to take into account considerations of peace and reconciliation. I assure you, the international criminal process, the wheels of justice often move extremely slowly. They can extend not only simply years, but sometimes it appears decades. I think in all sorts of ways, the prosecutor has the discretion just to make no decision yet, to delay, to defer, let things work out. Indeed, I am of the view, and I know the prosecutor is probably going to talk about it, that although I was sympathetic with the fact, given that there's a Security Council referral, that it should be done, that a prosecution in the middle of a civil war, in my mind, is presumptively a big mistake. Because first, you're not going to be able to get much evidence during the war itself. What's the rush? And second, and this was true in the Libyan case, after the British and French, of course, championed a Security Council referral, very unusual thing, essentially almost commanding the prosecutor, go after this guy. A month or two later, when it looked like there was something of a stalemate, the French and British diplomats were busy trying to figure out if they could make a deal in order to ship the leader, perhaps his sons as well, to Russia or somewhere else. In other words, they felt the constraints somewhat, and they were a little uncomfortable with them. The second guideline is that the prosecutor should proactively use the complementary provisions of the Rome Treaty to encourage the development of national institutions of accountability. I'm not going to go into the details of the complementarity. It's a complicated concept, but the basic notion is, under the jurisdictional provisions of the Rome Statute, if in fact the local government has the capacity through its own courts to do something adequate, the prosecutor is not supposed to prosecute. In other words, the international court is viewed as a backstop in many ways if the national court doesn't do the job. And I think, in fact, to the prosecutor's credit, it is the first prosecutor, our guest, very expansively interpreted the potential of complementarity and took a broader notion than simply it would necessarily, in all instances, require a domestic criminal prosecution. The door is still open that things like peace and reconciliation commissions, where there is individual accountability, but there aren't necessarily criminal sanctions, would be okay. The third and fourth, I suspect we don't have much argument about. I think the prosecutor should never acknowledge the validity of an unconditional blanket national amnesty program negotiated as part of the peace process. He should never publicly acknowledge the validity of what might be part of the deal. I think it's inconsistent with what the purposes of the Rome Statute were, and I'm very sympathetic that he shouldn't do it. Nor do I think the prosecutor should put himself in a position where he's explicitly bargaining with the devil. I think instead, using the mechanisms I suggested, he sometimes can defer. Now, I want to conclude simply by pointing out an obvious paradox. The exercise of prosecutorial discretion in the ICC is absolutely inevitable. There are budget constraints that are very serious. You don't have the capacity to investigate everything. These prosecutions are complicated and terrifically expensive. That's just a truth. You have to exercise discretion in deciding which cases you're going to go after, because there are plenty of potential abuses in the world, I assure you. And second, the explicit acknowledgement that the consideration of peacemaking efforts will be taken into account, I agree, threatens to undermine the ICC's legitimacy. That's somewhat paradoxical. And I guess what I will plead guilty to is a quote that you're all familiar with from Rochefoucauld. Hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. I am really suggesting that the International Criminal Prosecutor should probably say one thing, but that is, I'm not going to take it into account, but do something else. And I think it's part of the real world of applied pragmatism that at least I endorse. Thank you very much.
Ricky, you are a number 2 provocateur here. I suppose now Bob, with this line, is the bigger one, but for you were okay. So I was thinking, oh my God, now people will jump on him. No, they're okay with hypocrisy. It's okay. Let me do something. Oh. Okay. As you see, Bob Mnookin is very smart. I am presenting the opposite position, but he convinced me it's also called Mnookin. So it's a Mnookin versus Mnookin position. How to do? Where? I lost. Where is that?
Right there.
Wait, give me a second.
Oh, yeah, right there.
Yeah, I know. Okay. So, he convinced me, and he's right, that in fact, my position is also presented by Mnookin. So I will present the Mnookin position first. Here. Because Mnookin say, and I love this image, that when he was discussing on family courts, he explained the idea that the majority of divorce cases never reach the courts. Lawyers or even the people never go to the court, but they took the rules, and so the problem is solved in the shadow of the law. So it's not about what's happening in the courtroom, it's about how the courtroom affects the life of people who never go to the court. And in fact, that's the most interesting image of the court. That's the most important thing, not what's happening in the specific case, how the case impacts others. And in fact, that is the most interesting thing for a global court. Because how a tiny court in The Hague, who is doing we did in 10 years 13 indictees, how they can change the world, because basically the rulings of the court impact the 122 state parties of the Rome Statute. And in fact, Security Council includes us in Libya and Darfur, so in all the world. So the shadow of the court is the most important thing. And it's interesting because shadow, preventative impact is complicated to measure. Criminal lawyers never can justify because it's one causal is difficult to prove. But the shadow idea is very interesting because shadow is about not what's happened with criminals. It's not what's happened with Assad, how the diplomats, how the Obama, Sarkozy, the Qatar prime minister think on the law, how diplomats implement the law, how army commanders respect the law. So the shadow of the court includes all the actors in the world. And that's why the shadow of the court is the most important thing for me. And my discussion with Bob is, my job as a prosecutor was to protect the shadow. So my discussion with Bob is who and what can be negotiated. And the only point is, prosecutors should not negotiate, simple. And what can be negotiated, and it's something for Ms. Nelson who left. What I believe morally you cannot negotiate is let the person in charge keep committing the crimes. And that's the problem today with my example of Hitler. Hitler, as Gaddafi in Libya, and probably Assad in Syria, and Mr. Bashir in Darfur, they are in power because they commit crimes to stay in power. So part of the way for them to stay in power is committing massive atrocities against their own people, establishing fear. So committing massive atrocities is a critical part of their policy. They cannot stop and say, okay, to that stop I call election, freedom, democracy. No, they were out. That's the problem. When we are involved, it's true. There are limits on the negotiations. Stopping the crime is the moral priority. Stopping the crime is the moral priority, so let them go, it's okay. But not letting them stay in power. I conclude here. But because this morning was so interesting, I will go again. The real issue here is the following. I don't know if you know, it's a beautiful book from Michael Howard called The Invention of Peace. And basically he said, for 5,000 years, humanity used violence to manage conflicts. Peace was just the time between war and war. The idea of permanent peace is new, has 3 centuries, and the way to achieve it is through negotiations. And the interesting thing now, in addition to these 2 ideas, violence, massive violence, or negotiation, we have law, the idea of there is some legal limit to respect in the global scenario. And this idea has 10 years. So it's 5,000 years against 3 centuries against 10 years. That's why you don't know, hear a lot about the ICC, and that's why I'm here to try to explain some basic ideas about the ICC. Good. The issue is that, can humanity, not a national state, protect individual rights? That is a new concept. Yesterday when I was watching TV, here at the end, when they captured the guy, everyone was in agreement. Police was doing a great job, and people were happy with the police, and the prosecutor was explaining. Everyone understands that this individual deserves a lawyer and should be a fair trial, and journalists were discussing if this police intervention affected or not the evidence. So huge understanding. Everyone's in agreement on that. And that's exactly different in the global level. Yes, as Bob said, oh, if you prosecute Gaddafi, it will affect, not do it, yes, don't. Yes and no, no one was discussing the possibility. And that's a different, the protocols, the public protocols to work in justice issues at the national levels are totally clear, established. At the global level, new. And that is for me what we should work. So, I like to go back to your point today. The problem of evil is the problem of rationalization. I spent many of my time, I spent at least 17 years dealing with massive criminals. None of them say, I was right, I like to kill people, no problem for me. No, that's true. It's not a joke, that's true. And in fact, always they have justification. And in fact, they pretend that they were protecting their own people. It's not that they are bad, they are protecting their own people. That is a normal thing. In my country, I remember a general who explained to me, no, I told him, General, you cannot convince me that you were torturing and killing in order to protect freedom and democracy. And he said, prosecutor, these are our values. They are the enemy. And it's the same with the Tutsis, it's the same with the Al-Qaeda, it's the same. Any case you want, it's the same. So, evil is not about bad feelings, bad values. It's about protecting my community. That's it. That's why the idea to have a big shadow of the law help us to go beyond my own community. I belong to the global community. So, the second idea is I love this concept. Wrongdoing is not about individual behavior. It's a collective endeavor. Collective and systemic rationalization. You call this morning instigator, I think they are commanders. It's more than instigators. Massive atrocities are committed by groups normally organized in a hierarchical system. It's more than instigators. They are commanders. They give instructions in a system where people have not a lot of space to refuse to follow instructions. Or they're used to the idea to follow. But maybe nothing happened to them. So I insist, I like, in the second panel was much more about collective. The first panel was about individual. So when we think in evil, we think in individual morality. And I found when I make the question, you say, oh, no, it's individual. I'm not refused. Individual is true, but it's something else. And I think those who are discussing philosophy should think on this, because we need that. If not, we are missing the point. There's no individual killer here. It's a massive organization. Okay, that's my third point. The Rome Statute is an agreement, it's a treaty agreed by 122 states on the world, including all Europe, all Latin America, almost all African black, Arab countries coming, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Korea, Mongolia, and Afghanistan, in fact, and Georgia. So a lot of countries are there thinking this could not happen. And the idea is, it's a collective and systemic rationalization to prevent and punish what they consider the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. And that's your point about pluralistic. I think these guys define it, what is global and what is not global. My wife killed me is okay. The ICC had nothing to do. The ICC start to work when there are crimes against humanity, who are a widespread or systematic attack against civilian population, genocide or war crime. That's it. These three crimes are global. The rest is national. That's the first way to understand, yes, I can make a distinction what are global values and what national values that you make. And I have an interesting point on that. I went to Libya. Gaddafi was prosecuted for crimes against humanity. I went to Misrata, and that's the point for you, Bob. They were so pleased with me because I say, look, when you came with your idea of prosecuting Gaddafi, there was in that moment discussion to give Gaddafi half of the country and the other half of the country to Benghazi people. Benghazi were happy with that, but we, Misrata, were in the Gaddafi hands. So for us, was being killed. And then your indictment stopped this negotiation. And that for me was important to hold the law in the moment of the conflict. And my second part is about cultural. Because then, in this conversation, when you go to Misrata, it's very impressive because there are 5 miles of tanks destroyed on the side of the road. You say, how did people survive it? They say, will. That's why for us, your intervention was so important. You revamp our will. And they showed me pictures of the people who were killed. And I said, look, it's very impressive to see the pictures. But what I don't see here are the pictures of the girls raped. Where are they? They should not be marginalized after they were marginalized by the rapes. And he very proudly said, oh, we have a human rights program for them. Wow, how is that? I'm right, you are seated. He said, the problem with girls raped is that they lost their virginity. As a consequence of that, they cannot be married, and they became forever marginalized. To solve the problem, we propose to marry them. And to show leadership, even I have 2 wives, I married 2 girls. Okay, that's a national issue. That's Ricky will be right. Here, should I say, no, it's wrong? Oh, very interesting. Because of course, but that's why I like the Ricky provocation today. I think it's interesting because think on that. Of course, it's awful that the 15-year-old girl who was raped, but now her best option is to marry the 45, be the 3rd wife of a 45-year-old man. But at the same time, what we can do? This Islamic traditional system where families work in this way. Should we intervene from outside and say, no, it's wrong? It's complicated. Maybe the life of this girl is better. I don't know. I have no solution, but I see the problem. I see the massive rapes were my business. Yes, it's global. The solution for the girl is not my business. That is local, and that's something I don't know how to treat it. But I did not feel I have authority to say something wrong against him because he was very proud of his human rights program. So that's my point about it. So, and my last point on this is, yes, I believe the ICC is a global system which respect national and groups. Because first, it's adopted by consensus, so the states join the system. We are not imposing. But second, it's just about these most serious crimes. And third, we intervene if they don't intervene. So it's a backup system. And I think you working on this issue, you should understand, oh, this is a model which is working, and then you should justify that. I need you as a champion of the system, because no one knows this. In fact, I have a guy who's demonstrating against me in the door. I will show you the picture after. It's a guy outside who's picture against me because he say I'm against Africa, against Bashir, and he's demonstrating. And it's funny, so we are attacked by those who are Gaddafi, the US, Bush, but also by leftist people who believe we are part of imperialism. Machiavelli say, when you build a new institutions, there are 2 groups of enemies. Those who will lose power and those who are winning power, but they don't realize that. So basically, you're a crossfire. That's life. Okay, just now to my point on the hypothetical of Bob. For me, it's okay, do whatever deal you want, but there are implications. When you make this deal, are implications. Basically, if you are returning the power to Taliban, it's a victory. It's a Taliban victory. And you have to understand that. It's okay. You do it. But it's a Taliban victory. Will happen, probably. So I show that. So my first point is, yes, the prosecutor should take into consideration the conflict, but to hold the legal limits. To tell the political actors, guys, here is the law. You negotiate whatever you want, but here are the legal limits. And that's my job. And that was my job. No more. I'm happy I finished. So, and who can negotiate? In fact, it's the UN Security Council, not the prosecutor, that should manage the tensions. These are the rules. The UN, and I feel you are thinking globally, they are legal, not just moral ideas or professor ideas. These are legal systems adopted by our representatives. So the UN Charter established that the UN Security Council is in charge of peace and security. The Rome Statute, adopted by 122 states, recognized that and give the Security Council the power to stop any investigation, any prosecution. So in the hypothetical of Bob, they had to go to Security Council and ask them to stop. They had the right to do it, and I should say nothing. On the contrary, the prosecutor has a different mandate. The mandate of the prosecutor is to trigger the jurisdiction of the court, investigate and prosecute. Should not be involved in negotiations. That is the point. So these are the four suggestions of Bob. I comment some of them. Timing. It's so interesting because, as I said before, yes, some people were unhappy with my Libya timing, but the victims were very happy, and I'm proud. I like that. The victims are normally in my favor. They like that someone is listening to them. But just if, an experience I had, two stories. When I prosecuted the Minister of Sudan, Mr. Harun, I was with an ambassador. I met with an ambassador in New York, telling him, Ambassador, if you Security Council convince President Bashir, to surrender Harun, you stop the crimes in Darfur. Because Harun is the boss, no one else will commit crimes if this guy is in jail, if Bashir put him in jail. And the ambassador say, oh, it's a great idea, but we cannot do it. Why not? Because we have no idea how to do that. We had two strategies, bombing or nothing. I was thinking it was a joke. That, let's say, is not a joke. That is reality. That's why we need Bob training them. Because basically the two ideas are, when this guy is pissed off so much, we invade them. If not, we send someone to negotiate. Bombing or nothing, that's a strategy. And then, of course, those who want to negotiate, like Bob make in his presentation, they want free hands. They call me, oh, don't do that before. And then, because before you will jeopardize the negotiation. But then if you wait, after they say, oh, now we have an agreement, how you can prosecute them now that we reached an agreement? So, not before, not after, means never. And the last point, yeah. The last point on that is not about timing. It's about timing. So timing, the prosecutor had to go, his own logic had to follow. For mediators, no good idea before or after. That's clear. So the complementarity, the idea, yes, the prosecutor should respect national proceedings. But of course, in Bashir case, in Hitler case, in Gaddafi case, it's not possible to a national judge to investigate them. It's simply not possible. So relying on the national judges is stupid. They will not do it. They cannot do it. So basically, complementarity is okay, we respect that, but we will not wait for a prosecution in 1941, 1942, or maybe in 43, Hitler people died. No, they will not do it. So yes, and agree on no blanket amnesty, and no pre-bargaining with leader, I agree totally, but explain me a little detail on that. When we're going to present the case of Harun, a legal advisor of the one embassy at The Hague called my office and say, look, we learned that you are prosecuting a minister. My country considers it's not enough. You have to go higher. Okay, thank you for your opinion. Goodbye. Same day, same embassy, afternoon, she called back, say, oh my God, I'm so sorry because I sent a cable to the capital. And they said, no, how they can investigate and prosecute someone else? Now we are negotiating. Stop it. Can you stop? So if you try to be involved in the bargain, in the morning you have to go higher than the minister, in the afternoon you have to stop it. It's not Easy. So what I did as a proposal to Bob is to propose him guidelines. He had to adjust guidelines in the program on negotiation, really explaining you have to teach negotiators about the legal limits who are new, teach negotiators about the UN Security Council ability to stop any investigation and prosecution, teaching negotiators how to use the SEC as a leverage. Let me present. Eric is here. Eric did a Darfur conference few weeks ago. Richard Williamson, who was a Bush special envoy, was talking. He was the special envoy in Darfur for President Bush the last 6 months. And he was great. He said, first point, I don't like ICC. Second point, I met Mr. Ocampo before he indicted Bashir. I tried to convince him not to do it. Third point, when Ocampo prosecuted Bashir, I took advantage of it. I used as a leverage point. And I forced Bashir to accept the peacekeepers. That is a negotiator. That's a good. I don't like love. I like efficiency, and yes, and that's what we need. And the fourth point is, and that's connected with your idea of demonization. You have to be careful not to be manipulated for massive criminal. And Kony is a great example. Joseph Kony is a great example. So I finish here. I think there is no paradox, in fact. But I think it's no paradox. If we are hypocrites, people will hate that. And a prosecutor has to respect the most important moral value of the prosecutor is to respect the law. That's what the prosecutor should do, and that's why I believe your proposal should be ranked much higher than Ricky's proposal. Thank you so much.
Our last Abbott and Costello show will be professors Blum and Hyman. And they're going to contrast and compare everyday crimes, terrorist acts, and wars, all of which involve violent acts, all of which harm victims, but for which the legal response is often different. In whatever order, however you guys want to proceed. Ladies before gentlemen.
Abbott will go first, then Costello. So we are moving from the global to the domestic, or at least a little bit to the domestic. And a couple of years ago, Phil and I published a book together entitled Laws, Outlaws, and Terrorists. And we started the book by critiquing the Bush administration's reaction to the war on terrorism, quote unquote, and sort of this rejection of the laws of war, rejection of domestic law enforcement laws, and basically creating what we refer to as a no-law zone for handling terrorism. And instead we said, no, you need to be faithful to one paradigm or another, and even if you create or sort of move into a third paradigm, you need to be faithful to the underlying values and choices or as they were reflected in that existing body of law. One chapter in the book was dedicated to negotiating with terrorists and sort of with the kind of, the usual discussions you're familiar with. Are we rewarding bad behavior? Do we encourage more of that? Are we, bargaining with the devil? And sort of the usual discussions that go along with negotiating with terrorists. And so when Bob said, we're having this discussion about confronting evil, and there's this panel on bargaining with the devil, and can you speak? And I said, sure. I do everything that Bob tells me to do, by the way. This is just as a general matter. The obvious thing, just for economies of scales reasons, was to talk about negotiating with terrorists. And I then thought about it a little more, and sort of the puzzle of why did we ever, sort of in a book about terrorism, it makes sense to talk about negotiating with terrorism, but why do we think about negotiating with terrorists so differently from the way we normally talk about negotiating with violent people? For instance, plea bargains that are a common occurrence in our system. And then I thought, okay, there is a broader theme here, and the broader theme of the conference of confronting evil. Why don't we think about not just how we negotiate with terrorists, but how we confront terrorists, and how that is different from the ways we confront ordinary crime and or war, these two kind of extremes of the spectrum. Why is it specifically, when you think about crime, why is terrorism so obviously in our common rhetoric an evil in ways that we don't normally refer to when we talk about ordinary crime? So what we want to do here is, I'll just say that the events of this last week make this conversation that much more sensitive, but also I think more pertinent for us to kind of reflect on. So what we want to do is talk about just this puzzle of different attitudes toward different types of violence and try to think why that is. And then talk about how the legal responses are shaped very differently to each one of them. And I think they are shaped and motivated not just by objective constraints, but also by our psychological and social attitudes to each type of violence. And then explore the differences and suggest the prism of confronting evil as a way of reconsidering how and why should we think about crime and terrorism or war in these different ways. So just to begin with, in 2004, Catherine McKinnon published this very kind of powerful, polemic essay entitled The 9/11 of Women. And in that essay, she says, on 9/11, approximately 3,000 people were killed. If you compare that to the statistics of women who are killed by abusive partners, the numbers are just dwarfed, right? So far more women are killed by abusive husbands or partners than people on 9/11. So why don't we have, prosecutor, a crimes against humanity in the form of violence against women? Why are terrorists, why are the acts of 9/11 so obviously that, and why is violence against women not that? Now, McKinnon was making a point about gender, but there's obvious way in which you can extrapolate the question to ask not just about gender, but about violence far more broadly. And one thing is obvious, that terrorism attracts far more attention, far more resources, far more political commitments than any kind of crime, even though statistically each of us are much more likely to be victims of violent crime than victims of terrorism. So just to give a couple of numbers, from 1985 to 2012, the number of Americans killed, or the number of people killed in the United States by acts of terrorism, was 3,500 people. So 3,500 people over 27 years. If you bracket out the 9/11, we're talking about 500 people over 27 years. That's less than 20 people per year. In comparison, there are 17,000 homicides a year in the United States. 17,000, if you multiply that by 27, you get 459,000 people. Those are the numbers. And yet, as a society, we are far more ready to accept the existence of crime than the existence of terrorism. We accept, as a civic society, the costs of crime, even violent crime, because we think that the equal cost, or the cost that it would take to eliminate that number, are too high for us as a society to bear. Now, here what's interesting is that the comparison is not to earthquake, as Professor Neiman suggested earlier, not even to accidents, but to malicious human behavior. This is why the comparison, I think, is important and interesting. And it won't do here to simply say, well, the social effects of terrorism are so much broader than crime. Of course, that is true, but that's not exogenous. It's not a given. It's not an essential, inevitable outcome. It is partly a social reaction, a social decision, how to react. I have to say, friends of mine from Israel made fun of me all of yesterday about the sort of reaction here in Boston. This is not to say anything against that reaction, but the perception of how one reacts to the threat of terrorism is a social political decision. It's not a given, it's not inevitable, it is a choice. And with that in mind, I want to turn the kind of legal architectural choices to Phil.
So you've got all the sort of grand statements, and I get the legal architectural.
Yeah, that's.
But you do it with such grace.
Yeah.
Okay, so we want you to have in mind a mass murderer, as in Connecticut, perhaps terrorists, as in domestic terrorists, as in Boston and the Marathon, and foreign terrorists. Such as we have at Guantanamo, who are now on hunger strikes, and I don't know how many of you read the description of very brutal not intending to harm, I suppose, treatment of the hunger strikers from the New York Times. Okay. I want to show you that in almost every way, we treat terrorism more severely than crime, and just about as severely as war. I'll first document that very quickly with you, and then pose the question, why do we do that? Have we found a special type of evil, since that's the name we've been talking about today, that's associated with terrorism? It's possible. Or is this just mobilizing propaganda, which Gabby, I guess, was suggesting when she said there's no natural reaction by a state to terrorism. These are choices. These are political choices. Okay. Starting with the difference between domestic terrorism, the guy that will be brought to trial for the Boston Marathon, and the guy who will be brought to trial for the Connecticut massacre. Gabby pointed out to me that they are not giving Miranda rights to the terrorists captured yesterday. There's no particularly good reason why they shouldn't give him Miranda rights. He will almost certainly waive them. But they don't give him rights, and they will give the mass murderer in Connecticut Miranda rights. We will use on the Boston killer, the surviving one, a statute which is called the Material Support Statute, which goes further in reaching conduct. You don't have to go so far to reach his conduct, but it goes further in reaching conduct than what we will use on the Connecticut mass murderer. In other words, it reaches earlier conduct, plans at an earlier stage. They carried out their crimes, so that turns out to be irrelevant. For terrorism, we'll use the FBI as the investigative agency, as the lead investigative agency. You could sort of see that on television. For a domestic terrorist, like the one in Connecticut, it'll be the Connecticut local police. It'll be local police. We won't use the state police. And then the subject of this panel, plea bargaining, for a domestic terrorist, the chance of his bargaining with the state for a reduced sentence is 1/10 of the chance of anybody else bargaining with the state for a reduced sentence. We simply don't like bargaining with terrorists. And for the average sentence for somebody convicted of material support, the perhaps least serious of terrorist crimes, is about 15 years. The average sentence for other crimes could be, it's a little hard to tell what you put in other crimes, but it could be 5 years. So the sentences are harsher. The agreements to plead are less. The procedures at trial are less generous. The statutes that are used are more far-reaching and more difficult to disentangle yourself from. If I were to include the people who are in Guantanamo, I could say, well, targeted killing is fine for foreign terrorists, including an American abroad, Al-Awlaki. You can't kill a criminal suspect who's running away without being able to establish that his running away would create itself a brand new danger of a quite imminent type. With, I guess, American terrorists as well as foreign terrorists, we have a special statute to allow us to search their quarters, and the same special statute allows us to reach further in terms of electronic surveillance. We can detain both Americans and foreigners, though we only do it with foreign terrorist suspects, in a way that we can't do with the Connecticut killer. With foreign terrorists, we can use and have used renditions to states that will treat him relatively violently and torture. We don't do that with any domestic criminal. Let me stop there. I have about 5 more, but they go on and on. It's a very different regime. Well, you could say, well, that's because this is war. The Bush administration called it war. Most of the sort of people who purport to be experts in terrorism have adopted the war language. But the 3 reasons we don't give the same treatment to people in wartime as we give to domestic criminals, murderers, is that, for one thing, to create the institutions you need, a trial, a court, defense attorneys, prosecutors in an active war zone is impossible. It would be tremendously complicated and risky. The risk of releasing, the idea of convicting beyond a reasonable doubt somebody who is in the middle of a war, a uniformed soldier against you, would be a ridiculous way of leaving dangerous people out on the streets. So we don't want the same rules, the same 10 guilty people should be freed for 1 innocent people convicted. We don't want that in wartime. And finally, for wartime, we have a separate body of law that's been developed over the years, humanitarian law, the law of war, the Geneva Conventions. When you think about it, none of these apply to terrorism. None of these reasons why we treat people differently in wartime than we treat them in charging them with crimes, none of them applies. We don't have difficulty bringing them to a safe courthouse. We can fly them into New York. If it weren't for the Congress, who you so slandered this morning, the Congress has forbidden the president to bring anybody into the United States, even from Guantanamo, let alone from anywhere else in the world. But we could easily do that. It would not be troublesome. So the administrative convenience isn't a problem. Beyond a reasonable doubt can be handled fine with regard to terrorists. I should have looked up for you the number who were acquitted. I'm pretty sure I can count them on one hand. And there's no sensible alternative system like the law of war for terrorists. The alternative system makes it easy to have special rules for actual customary wars. But it doesn't work very well with terrorists because terrorists are never in uniform, and all the protective provisions of the law of war only apply to people who are in uniform. So they're all excluded. Okay. So what is it that makes it? That's where Gabby and I are, and just when it gets hard, I'm going to turn it back to Gabby to serve her right. What is it that causes us to treat terrorism so much more severely than we treat the massacre in Connecticut, and so much more severely than we actually treat prisoners of war and others in times of war, because we deny prisoner of war treatment to terrorists? And is it something about terrorism that touches our sense of evil in an honest and defensible way? Or is it that our leaders, George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, have simply mobilized us at a time of fear in a nonsensible way? There's an obvious answer to that, and Gabby's going to give it to you.
Oh my, that was bad.
That was a setup, yeah. So no, I don't have the answer. The psychologists in the room are familiar with at least some of the explanations that are often given to these puzzles. One is sort of the dramatic nature of the event, right? So the dramatic nature of a bomb going off and just the magnitude, the killing of many people at once, that is much more capturing of our attention, of our sentiment, and the sort of incremental killing that you don't necessarily see, that isn't that vivid, that we get sensitized to. Partly it's based on a false assumption about control. So people have false beliefs about their ability to control crime or their likelihood to be victims of crime. And it turns out that it's true that in 70%, I think, of homicide cases, the victim knows the assailant. Now, having known the assailant doesn't guarantee that you can protect yourself or control the murder, let alone for the 30% who are unfamiliar with the perpetrator. So that belief is also false. It's just a psychological bias that isn't true. It may be about the foreignness of the perpetrator, the fact that terrorists are foreign. Even if they're domestic, they're foreign. There's something foreign about them, their national origin, their religion, something about them that is foreign, and therefore allows us to outcast them in ways that we're more hesitant to do when it is just a regular killer. And partly it may be about the collective nature of the whole thing, the collective nature of the perpetrators and the collective nature of the victims who are attacked not for who they are, but for their association, which then makes it much closer to your realm of the war crime, of the collective nature of the effort, rather than the very individual kind of intimate case of the murder. I'm not sure any of this is really rational. I'm not sure any of it is really convincing. It's also a question whether it should be rational or convincing. So even there is a question whether this is completely a cynical manipulation by politicians, or is it okay for a politician, maybe it's even incumbent upon politicians, to follow or respond to popular sentiments, even if they are irrational. So if you believe that democracy is about maximizing preferences or representing your preferences, maybe it is the leader's obligation, certainly choice, to respond to these preferences as irrational as they are. So I'm not sure where that leaves us. It does puzzle me why the tragedy of what happened at West Texas 2 days after Boston, with 14 people dead, everything that seems not to be just an accident, but kind of really gross negligence, at the very least, by the managers of the plant, basically goes unattended. And this is not Joshua Green's remote island. This is what some people would say part of the United States of America. So this is really a puzzle for me, and maybe a call to think about how we prioritize evil, how we prioritize our response to evil, and whether, I don't know if this is the system 1 or system 2, but maybe pause for a minute and think about how we allocate resources, how we allocate attention, how we allocate concern about different kinds of evil. Thank you.
What a terrific presentation. I'd like to ask one question, which I think all four of you might want to respond to, which wasn't included in Phil and Gabby's presentation. And that is, I think, the special dilemmas posed by what I'll call asymmetric warfare. And that is circumstances where the terrorist is not wearing a uniform. And I want a situation where the terrorist isn't necessarily domestic, or is domestic but in fact influenced by a foreign ideological group that is in fact declared war. And I guess what I really want to ask is, to what extent, what should be the norms in those circumstances? I would agree with you, by the way. I don't want to sort of debate whether they could be tried in U.S. courts. I think they could be. I think they'd be convicted. I don't mean that so much. But I think that you can't understand, if the terrorist is some isolated kook, I think, in fact, the reaction is quite different than, in fact, it's viewed as part of Osama bin Laden had declared war on the United States. And in fact, it was a project that had been very carefully planned, et cetera. So in that sense, even though it was only 3,000, and we have more murders than that every year, It's a very different kind of proposition. But it involves an act where it's not they're sending their army across the border, where in the conventional way in the Westphalian system, you then can declare war on them with our army fighting their army. It's a much more amorphous kind of ideological context. And I wonder, is that relevant?
Maybe let me try. I'm going to give you a non-legal answer. The non-legal answer, maybe let's think about targeted killings. I support targeted killings. I believe they are sometimes necessary, sometimes essential, sometimes legitimate, sometimes necessary, sometimes moral. What bothers me is how, for instance, the term imminence that we use in domestic law has been interpreted on the targeted killings front. It's hard for anybody to convince me, and I'm not privy to the intelligence, nobody showed me the dossiers. It would be very hard to convince me that there was such an imminent threat from hundreds of people that justify hundreds of times of use of that tactic. And I think this is what I'm talking about. So as citizens, as members of a community, we live with risk every day. We accept risk in our normal lives. We cross the street, we interact with other people, we live in houses, we drive cars, we go on airplanes. We live with constant degrees of risk from many, many places. A country also needs to live with risk. This is what it means to be part of an international community, and you can't expect to minimize your risk to zero. When President Bush first announces our war on terrorism is not going to end until the last terrorism is caught and brought to justice, this is absurd. It's a good, maybe rhetorical move to mobilize support, but it's of course an absurd statement about what is permissible or impermissible, what the possible goals of war should be. And so should you be able to fight enemies who don't follow the rules, who do follow the rules, who wear uniform, who don't wear uniform? The answer is yes, absolutely. There is a question of how much is morally permissible, politically permissible, legally permissible to shift the risk from your own territory or your own people onto people in other places. And that, to me, is the real problem with targeted killings. Not the fact that we do them, not the fact that we do them even against U.S. citizens. It's the prevalence, the regularity, the routine nature of doing them that upsets me or concerns me.
Charles?
Well, I must say, I'm a little bit surprised at all this sort of legal breastfeeding over targeted killings. It's obscuring the fact that a drone attack sure beats an invasion. And George W. Bush invaded first Iraq and then Afghanistan, and President Obama is falling back on targeted killings or drone attacks. Sure, I accept Gabby's point that a lot of it has been overdone, and I also accept in principle the notion that targeted killings should be taken away from the CIA and transferred to the military, provided that the military can do such a good job in Pakistan without the intelligence base that the CIA has. But I think in principle the CIA it's too toxic for the CIA to be involved in the drone program. It should be given to the military. And in fact, the joystick wielders in Nevada, they're military seconded to the CIA.
Luis?
I think it's very interesting for philosophers and psychologists to try to catch some of the reality we are presenting to you, because we need you thinking on the real life, on the real world. And talking about this, I would suggest, you mentioned Afghanistan and Iraq are different, legally are different. Afghanistan was completely legitimate invasion. Iraq was not, was a unilateral decision. But interesting, both ended pretty bad. And in fact, Libya was a different approach with no soldiers on the ground and did work pretty well. So I think we should start to think this idea to send troops to the ground is complicated because normal democracies cannot implement the type of things to achieve in this country. It's complicated. So I think we have to rethink that. On the targeted killings. Suppose Israel. I don't know if Israel can Israel target killings, do target killings in Iran? And then, as a consequence, can Iran do target killings in Israel? If U.S. is fighting with, with Canada one day, can U.S. decide, okay, we'll do target killing of the prime minister because he's the chief commander, and Canada do the same here? And then you are in Washington, a nice celebration, bam, the drones of Canada are coming. So that's why these issues require some kind of process, and probably require some legitimacy. It's not just unilateral, because what you do when you produce unilateral is you produce reactions. You produce reaction, and that is a part of the problem.
Phil?
I'd just like to point out that Israel has, at least in its Supreme Court rulings, a watered-down law of war. Watered down in the sense it's more protective of terrorists than the law of war is, because the law of war excludes anybody who isn't in uniform. So Israel interprets the law of war to be more protective. Britain and France interpret their domestic law to be more vigorous. There's a middle ground between a law of war that doesn't give any protection to anybody and a domestic law which may feel inadequate. And there's something about the fear of terrorism, the magic, the evil of it, that is keeping us from moving into that middle ground where Britain, France, Italy, Israel are.
I saw a number of hands. Tony? Give Professor Shays the...
I'm loud anyway. I'm Tony Chase. I teach at Fletcher. I think the reaction to terrorism is based on the fact that it's a gray area of war, and cyber war is another gray area. And I think what you're seeing now is real confusion. It's not that law doesn't exist, but I think the United States simply doesn't know which law to apply. The attack on the World Trade Center, the first one, was treated simply as a crime. It was the magnitude and the shock of the second one that threw us into this kind of legal limbo. So I think it's going to take a long time, and I think your analysis is really excellent. But the fact is, it is war, and it is a type of war that we're in now. And terrorism, we may overreact to a domestic terrorist, and we underreact to a mass murderer, as in Newtown, Lanza, in part because of the NRA. I mean, we try to sweep under the rug the kind of issues. But I think the sooner that we recognize that it's war and that we need to put this on a kind of wartime legal footing, the better off we'll be in terms of due process and human rights.
Mazrin? Could you hand the phone? Thank you.
First of all, I think the answer is no, but are you saying that we don't have data on how much resources we spend in each of these different categories, and that we don't know what public reaction is to each of these? Or is there some nice report that tells us this is the amount of money that we spend when a black kid in Chicago is killed, 20, I think, every month, versus the one that happened en masse in Connecticut, versus each of these? So do we have any evidence? Because it seems to me that in a very different situation, when you decide how to spend resources, I think when Warren Buffett and Bill Gates decide how much money to spend on a particular disease, they sit with a bunch of spreadsheets. And they look at how many people die, where they die in the world, how much suffering that causes, and they make not a perfectly rational decision, but a reasonably rational decision about how to allocate funds to these. So it seems to me that the first question we would have to ask is there such a map? Do we know what public reaction is to each of these different types of horrors? And second, what resources does the government and the states, what do they spend on each of them? If we do know the answer to that, then it becomes quite easy to look at the main effects and interactions between each of these levels, such that the more shocking the crime, the foreignness, and so on. And there's just lots of good evidence from psychology on predicting where it should be. the one I'm familiar with because we did this study jointly with Liz Phelps at NYU, is to actually just look at skin conductance levels when somebody from your own in-group threatens you versus somebody from an out-group threatens you. And for both black and white Americans, fear towards members of their own group is high when they harm you, but as soon as they stop harming you, fear starts to fall off much more rapidly towards members of your own group than the out-group. And that difference is something that probably would predict the difference in how we respond to acts of terrorism that are domestic versus foreign. So we can do a lot of those analyses.
Thank you. I'm going to follow Jackie's example, and I'm going to take 3 questions and then ask for response. I promise to keep my word that we're going to finish the formal session at 6. I saw Jackie Baba first and then Homi Baba. Okay.
I had a question about the distinction between foreign and domestic terrorism. I mean, you talk, Gabi, as if the line was really clear. But say, for argument's sake, that this Boston case, we only have the 19-year-old who's American alive. Say, for argument's sake, that it turns out that there isn't an international network. Say it turns out that he actually was not particularly indoctrinated into, you know, kind of the schoolings in, you know, Islamic fundamentalism. How would we, but say he had some sort of, you know, hatred, maybe induced by his brother, it doesn't matter, you know, against the society he's living in. How would we contrast that, say, with the Oklahoma City bomber, or indeed with what happened in Newtown, or think of Norway, what happened in Norway and the killing of those. I mean, is it just what passport the killer has? Does it depend on the network that they're part of? Does it depend on the ideology that they articulate as opposed to the reality of their life? I find this very sort of apparently clear distinction actually complicated.
Homi?
So I was going to ask a similar question, and I now have to ask it.
You want to pass?
No, I don't want to. Because I think I actually disagree. No, not disagree. I think there's a different emphasis here. I too was interested in that particular question, and I wanted to know where do we reach to find the kind of ideological factors of insecurity that really create this distinction between the homebred, indigenous, and the foreign. Is it something to do with foreign policy, the way foreign policy works in a kind of imago, as Jeremy Waldron would say, not exactly, but a general sense of what foreign policy is? Why is a country where there is a frequent murder, killing, use of arms, indigenous terror, or suddenly terrorism, which is associated with Islam, or is it? Why does that become so terrifying? I want a general ideological answer. So it's in terms of the general ideology of things. Then, is it to do with American exceptionalism, foreign policy? But then the other question is one that actually I think may be connected in a broader philosophical way. You said something at the start of this session, Bob. You said the issue of justice.
Yeah.
Justice always looks backwards in order to move forwards. It looks back in order to sort out something for the future, to set things right for the future. And in fact, Avishai, in his book on moral witnessing, asks a very similar question. Why does the moral witness always have to look backward in order to set the terms for the future? And I wondered whether that might link our first session with this session, but also raising this question in terms of the pursuit of justice, pursuit of security. How much? What Gabriela said, when do we know? We can't have complete security, but that's always the problem. Where is the slippery slope? Where do we draw the line? That's the issue.
Okay. And the third, I saw Lee Ross.
This is just a comment, I think, expanding slightly what Mazarin said, and that is, there's a real sense in which psychologically the point about terrorism is that the magnitude of the offense is greater because it's an offense against more people. So you can think of a 2x2, as psychologists like to do, and is it him against that other him? Is it him against us? Is it them against us? and that's a scale. And the most serious of those is when it's perceived as one of them attacking us, because then it's actually like almost it would take you into the domain of tort law. We have all been attacked, and that's a very serious crime. There are interesting parallels. We treat the crime of treason different from a lot of other crimes which might be similar in terms of the act that they involve, but it's an attack on us, on a collective us. So I think if we were to do the kind of study that Mazarin suggests, I think you would find that that would be the dimension that we start to pick up. And of course, there are some
Lee, let me, just because of time,
cases.
I think it's a very helpful comment. I'd really want to give our panel an opportunity to respond. Phil?
As to Mazarin, I can tell you that we don't do anything remotely like what you're proposing. The figures probably roughly exist, and it sounds like a very good idea that we would do it. But we don't, I can guarantee you that we don't carefully calculate expenditures on life-saving or on dealing with dangerous people. The rules on the claimed legal justification is identical for U.S. people and foreigners. The administration claims, there might be some small exception to this, but claims the same powers over targeted killing, detention for U.S. people as it does for an Afghan. But the process, the political choices are vastly different. We've detained 1,000 people in Guantanamo. We've detained either one or two Americans. We have killed, through targeted killing, a large number of people. We have targeted one or two Americans. Okay, it's the practice that gets to be different. Now, what's an American? There's a big body of law. It's called a U.S. person. It's not called a citizen. It's called a U.S. person, and many, many laws turn on it. A U.S. person is either a citizen or a resident alien, and anybody in the United States, whether a citizen and a resident alien or not, gets the same rights as U.S. persons. So the rules are all written in terms of, they may turn out to be the same, which I told you at the beginning, but there's a category that appears over and over again in our law, which is called a U.S. person, and that includes citizens, resident aliens, and the same rights come to anybody who's in the United States at the time.
Phil, that's very helpful. Charles?
Yeah, two quick points from that take off from what the Homi Baba said. Firstly, Chechens have been very present in international activities of terrorism in Al-Qaeda and related organizations in Iraq and elsewhere. They've been very present. Number two, judging from the disaffected comments of the older brother, maybe we don't do such a good job of integrating foreigners as we think we do.
On measuring cost, I think it's a very interesting idea, but it's showing how remote we are from the problems, and how this meeting, that's why it was so interesting. I would suggest you have to measure, because, for instance, he mentioned that there was a coup d'etat in Iran that U.S. and the British supported, and the rationale is about oil. The cost was, after we have a lot of, including the cost, all the money you're spending with Iran now, and the threat to Israel. So that's why it's complicated, because sometimes the decisions are today and the consequences are remote, but in different space, in time of space, remote in space and in time. But I think it's important you start to include that, because that's the problem. We are living in a global, humanity is connected, but we have no institutions. And in fact, you are the professor of the world. It's one place that could think globally is Harvard. And today shows I ignore most of the things you say, but also probably you ignore the things we are saying. And they have to merge and have to think more. My last point, one is long-term distance between the impact decision-making process. The second point is about U.S., in particular since Al-Qaeda, transformed national security in a global issue. Then in Darfur, when we indicted President Bashir, were three factors. Darfur genocide, which they never again. Al-Qaeda information, Salah Ghosh, the head of intelligence of Sudan, was providing intelligence on Al-Qaeda, and the South-North, and how to manage this conflict, okay? And I understand the need to receive intelligence because I could say, look, there are so few cases of terrorists because we are very good in controlling terrorists outside. In fact, this shows that our policies are good because you have not so many cases here, but have cost. This policy of prioritizing national security has cost. In the Darfur case, it's an ongoing genocide. We are ignoring Darfur genocide. In fact, some in the bottom say very proudly, no, your Bashir indictment was good. We saved the South, the independence, with your Bashir indictment because you used it as a pressure on Bashir. Yes, so you let a genocide ongoing to protect Al-Qaeda intelligence and the South. That's the type of real life we are living, and we need philosophers analyzing these real problems.
Look, we've got time. Oh, Gabby, please.
Maybe just a quick note on that. I don't want to sound completely cosmopolitan. I'm not naive. I don't believe that any country or group of citizens today can function on the basis of fully cosmopolitan value. I don't expect that. I'm not even sure I should want it, but I leave that aside. Of course, we're going to value American lives more than we do over the genocide in Darfur or anywhere else. The point is that there is a difference between defensive and offensive postures. If the United States want to spend billions and billions of dollars on STA and other defensive mechanism, policing on the streets, searches, immigration, that's okay. It's an American choice. The policy should come together, decide how to prioritize different things, cancer research, crime, accidents, terrorism, and that's okay. Any decision they make, it's okay. My problem begins when you export these costs outside, and that is where the trade-offs begin to be less legitimate. One very quick answer to Lee's point. Of course, you're right. But what Catherine McKinnon would say, I think, is that them versus us is also a construction. That for her, it's a construction of men against women. The men are them, the women are us, and we turn that into a battle that looks very differently from the man who killed his wife.
Karen McKinnon does see it
Right.
as a crime
Of
by
the group.
them against
That's right.
us,
Exactly.
and
The
for
group
that reason
perpetrator.
she's willing to
That's exactly
prioritize
right.
it.
Right.
That's exactly the
That's
point.
right.
I think we have time. Actually, we don't have time. Forgive me. What I hope you'll agree with me is that this is a conversation that's worthy of having begun, and I would hope in a variety of ways, in various institutional settings, it will be continued. I want to express for Homie and myself and for the staffs of PON and the Humanities Center our deep gratitude to all the panelists and to all of you for your patience and being here all day. And now I hope you will join us at a reception that is, you're going to show us where it is.
It's where we had lunch.
It's where some of us had lunch, but the others,
Oh, it's in the Barker.
it's in the Barker. You can follow the crowd. Thank you so much.